All right, this hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Trump administration's budgetary and policy priorities in the Middle East for fiscal year 2020. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the FY20 budgets for the Department of State's Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, as well as USAID's Bureau for the Middle East. I thank the witnesses for appearing today. I now recognize myself for purposes of making an opening statement. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Schenker and Assistant Administrator Harvey, for testifying today. Nearly 3 years into the Trump administration, the United States faces a multitude of challenges in the Middle East. While the administration touts its maximum pressure policy, Iran continues to destabilize countries from Iraq to Yemen to Lebanon. Despite President Trump's bellicose rhetoric, Tehran has been able to launch attacks on international shipping and regional states, undermining U.S. deterrence and credibility in the process. The Iranian nuclear program is more advanced today than it was on the day that President Trump took office, and the international community is more divided in confronting it. Iran continues to unjustly imprison Americans, including my constituent Bob Levinson, and violate the human rights of its own people. Iran also continues to support Bashar al-Assad and fuel the conflict in Syria, which has led to the deaths of more than 600,000 people and the displacement of millions both inside Syria and in neighboring countries. This conflict and the humanitarian crisis it created will reshape the Middle East for decades to come, but our policy in Syria remains ambiguous at best. President Trump has now twice announced the rapid and complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, with little notice given to international allies and partners on the ground. His approach has ceded U.S. leverage over a future political solution in Syria, placed American troops and civilians in danger, undermined our credibility, removed pressure on ISIS, and betrayed our Syrian partners who fought valiantly in recent years to counter ISIS with American support. I commend the successful operation this weekend to take out ISIS leader al-Baghdadi, but I caution that the removal of one individual should not validate our current withdrawal strategy. If anything, it should show us the importance of our counterterrorism mission and cooperation with partners on the ground in Syria. The President has also provided a strategic victory to our adversaries. Russia has used military force, economic support, and weapon sales to become the arbiter of Syria's future and to increase its regional influence at the expense of the United States. Yemen remains ravaged by civil conflict, foreign intervention, and the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The Trump administration has offered unstinting support to Saudi Arabia and the UAE in their military campaign in Yemen, ignoring the bipartisan support in Congress for ending U.S. military support for coalition operations. And while I understand the risk posed by the Houthis and Iranian forces, the conflict has led to tens of thousands of civilian casualties, shifted focus from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and dramatically worsened a humanitarian catastrophe. The region also faces ongoing challenges. Israel confronts threats on its borders from terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas, and peace with the Palestinians remains elusive. People in the West Bank seek a prosperous future, while Gazans suffer in need of humanitarian aid. The dispute splitting the Gulf Cooperation Council is at a stalemate. Libya, a state on the doorstep of Europe, is fractured and an arena for an expanding proxy war between regional powers. However, U.S. policy must not be solely reactionary and only respond to the many crises in the Middle East. It must also be forward-looking and grasp the many opportunities in the region. A youth bulge, approximately 45% of the Middle East is under 25 years old, presents a chance to reset U.S. relations with the people of the region in the coming decade. Tunisia just completed a successful round of elections as the country moves forward on the difficult path of democratic development. Protesters took to the streets in Algeria on Friday for the 36th week in a row to demand their government root out corruption and better meet the needs of people. In fact, in recent weeks, protests have gripped other countries throughout the region, including Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq, and led to the resignation of Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri earlier today. More than 8 years after millions took to the streets to protest corruption and autocracy, these demonstrations indicate that too many regional governments remain unaccountable to their people and opposed to open civil society, transparency, and human rights. I'm disappointed that the Trump administration has offered an inconsistent message on human rights and democratic values. At a time when many are questioning American commitment to the region, the administration has too often turned a blind eye to human rights abuses and equivocated in expressing support for good governance in the Middle East. The administration often articulates maximalist goals in the Middle East, but has cut the resources needed to achieve them. For the third straight year, the Trump administration has proposed drastic cuts to our foreign affairs budget. The FY20 budget requested an estimated $6.5 billion in total bilateral assistance to the MENA region, a figure that is 6% less than the FY19 request and 11% less than what Congress appropriated in FY19. This subcommittee has oversight responsibility over the NEA Bureau and Middle East Bureau budgets, and I hope this hearing today can help us get some better understanding of the administration's strategy and a clearer articulation of U.S. policy in the Middle East and how we are allocating resources to accomplish our objectives in the region. I'm grateful to the witnesses for appearing, and with that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Wilson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important hearing examining the Trump administration's policy objectives for the turbulent Middle East. We appreciate our distinguished witnesses, Assistant Secretary David Schenker and Assistant Administrator Michael Harvey, for their extraordinary service and for their testimony before the committee today. Formulating U.S. policy is not easy, but letting alone the crafting of policy of so many complexities in a region like the Middle East with centuries of conflict. But our two witnesses surely have their jobs cut out for them, and we thank them for their positive efforts. Indeed, the Middle East has vexed both Republican and Democrat administrations alike, but despite the difficulties, the United States has remained engaged in the region. We have been invested in the people and the potential of the Middle East. Although we may have disagreed across the aisle about specific policies, we can all agree that U.S. engagement and commitment to the Middle East is necessary. It is definitely preferred to a Middle East in which rogue regimes like Russia, Iran, or China are power brokers. To be fair, the Trump administration has presided over many important successes in the Middle East. Today's hearing comes just days after the U.S. Special Forces successfully conducted a raid in the northwest Syria, which led to the deserved death of the leader of ISIS, the murderous Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But to ensure that this murderous ideology of ISIS does not resurrect from the ashes of Syria and Iraq will require an enduring American commitment, not just to the global war against terrorism, but to the stability of the Middle East itself. I also commend this administration for spearheading the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. This is the right approach against the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. But I'm deeply concerned about the current approach is simply not enough. In the past year alone, Iran has cemented its stranglehold over Iraq and Lebanon and significantly increased the amount of territory it controls in Syria. It appears that there is only so much that can be accomplished through economic sanctions alone. How are we working to push back the increased Iranian influence in the region in ways other than sanctions? Consistently over the decades, the Iranians have remained committed to exporting their evil ideology throughout the Middle East, fostering terrorism, sectarianism, and violence everywhere. Meanwhile, the United States has sought to support democracy in the region, hemming and hawing about its role in the region. There are plenty of reasons for the U.S. to renew its resolve and commitment to the region. The Middle East today is teeming with potential. In the past year alone, we've seen the citizens of Sudan, Egypt, Algeria, and most recently, Iraq and Lebanon take to the streets and give expression to their democratic aspirations. I'm even hopeful that the spark of liberty will one day ignite a democratic movement in Iran as well, which has such a historic background reflective of the Persian culture. Just last week, the world as we inspired as the runner-up in Tunisia's presidential elections met with the country's newly elected president, a sign of strengthened faith in Tunisia's democratic institutions. I was fortunate to travel to Tunisia last month with the Helsinki Commission, and I was inspired to see this fledgling democracy in action. The U.S. must not concede influence to those who counter the spirit of democracy and freedom in the Middle East. There is simply no substitute for U.S. leadership in the region. I look forward to hearing from the distinguished witnesses today, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. It's now my pleasure to introduce the witnesses. And before I do, without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Assistant Secretary David Schenker is the Assistant Secretary of Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. He was sworn in on June 14, 2019. Prior to joining the Department of State, Assistant Secretary Schenker was Director of the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He previously served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Levant Country Director, and he was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service in 2005. Before joining the government in 2002, he was a research fellow at the Washington Institute and a project coordinator of large centrally funded USAID projects in Egypt and in Jordan. Assistant Administrator Harvey, Michael Harvey, was appointed Assistant Administrator of USAID's Middle East Bureau in January 2019. He comes to the position after serving more than 30 years as a Foreign Service Officer for USAID, with multiple overseas assignments, including Mission Director in Nigeria, Mission Director in the West Bank and Gaza, Deputy Mission Director in Iraq and Jordan. He most recently served as a faculty member of the National War College in Washington, D.C., and chaired USAID's task force to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria as assistant to the administrator. Assistant Administrator Harvey has received numerous awards from the Department of State and USAID for his exceptional service. Thank you both for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements in their entirety will be made part of the hearing record. Again, thank you so much for being here today. Assistant Secretary Schenker, you are recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, thank you for inviting us here today to discuss the president.
Pull the microphone a little closer.
Yeah, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for inviting us here to discuss the President's FY 2020 budget requests. Stability is the administration's imperative in the Middle East and North Africa to protect the American people and our interests abroad. That core objective, which benefits U.S. interests as well as the region's, drives our diplomatic and foreign assistance. The President's FY 2020 foreign assistance budget request of $6.6 billion for the region will support national security priorities to counter Iran's malign influence, ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, support persecuted religious and ethnic minorities throughout the region, and maintain support to key allies and critical partnerships across the region. The request also recognizes that the United States cannot alone bear sole responsibility for addressing challenges in the region. The President's request places an emphasis on burden sharing, leveraging the U.S. taxpayer dollars against investments from our regional partners and the international community. The administration's Iran strategy focuses on neutralizing Tehran's destabilizing influence and constraining its malign activities, particularly its support for terrorism and militants. Strong diplomatic, economic, and security measures must be bolstered by U.S. assistance programs that support key partners and seek to deny access and influence to Iran and its proxies. Resources requested in this budget will counter Iran's malign influence in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, by working through our partners, our local partners. The territorial defeat of ISIS in Iraq and Syria is a major milestone that should not be underestimated. The FY 2020 request reflects significant progress in encouraging our allies to support stabilization activities in Syria. We also continue to hold ISIS accountable for the atrocities it committed, including genocide against members of Iraq's persecuted communities. Ensuring the survival of Iraq's minority religious and ethnic communities is a vital interest of the United States and stands in direct opposition to the extremist vision ISIS sought to impose on Iraq. U.S. assistance will enable Iraq to become a constructive, stabilizing influence in the region. The FY 2020 request of $166 million supports U.S. assistance that promotes further integration of Iraq into the global economy, which in turn will create opportunities for U.S. businesses and jobs here at home. As we've seen over the last few weeks, stabilization in Syria will require more resources than one country alone should provide. We expect our allies and partners to increase contributions to stabilize Syria and ensure that ISIS cannot return. In Yemen, we are working with international donors to address critical humanitarian needs that will help create a foundation for durable peace. In addition, the FY 2020 budget requests $41 million in economic assistance to support the Yemeni people and their institutions. The FY 2020 budget reflects our commitment to comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace, which hinges on a safe and secure Israel, consistent with the 2019 through 2028 MOU between the United States and Israel. The President's budget requests $3.3 billion of FMF for Israel, the single largest foreign assistance investment in the region. The administration continues to work toward a comprehensive and lasting peace between Israel and Palestinians. In support of these efforts, the President's FY 2020 budget request includes $35 million in security assistance for the Palestinian Authority security forces and includes funding in the Diplomatic Progress Fund that could also be used for assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. Encouraging deeper partnerships between Israel and its neighbors will reduce Israel's international isolation and improve regional security. The FY 2020 request includes $1.275 billion for Jordan, consistent with the 2018 bilateral MOU. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for sharing the administration's staunch support for the U.S.-Jordan relationship. The U.S. assistance has helped Jordan weather the impact of the Syrian crisis and supports the longstanding U.S.-Jordanian relationship. Egypt, the region's most populous country, is also important to U.S. interests. The FY 2020 request includes $1.3 billion in FMF to support the Egyptian Armed Forces' capacity to counter terrorism in the Sinai and secure the country's land and maritime borders, including the Suez Canal. In closing, the President's FY 2020 request contributes to achievement of our national security priorities in the region and supports advancements to advance our interests. Thank you for your enduring support to our diplomacy in the region and our foreign assistance investments. Our ability to respond quickly to needs in the region and allocate funding effectively requires your continued support. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Schenker. Assistant Administrator Harvey, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the important role of the development and humanitarian assistance programming in advancing U.S. interests in the Middle East and North Africa. It's an honor to be here with Assistant Secretary Schenker and to be representing Administrator Green and the professionals of USAID. USAID recognizes that most of the nations in this region are actually middle-income countries, countries with young populations whose energy, education, and inspiration can be tapped to help speed their country's journeys to self-reliance. We believe well-targeted investments by the United States and other donors can play a critical role in helping these countries lock in democratic advances where they have occurred and drive job-creating economic growth through modern free market economies. In line with administration policies, USAID focuses its programming to support our friends and allies and steadily work toward graduating countries from foreign assistance. Helping partners build self-reliance is key to the broader U.S. effort to counter malign influences coming from outside while demonstrating American values in the context of renewed great power competition. In Iraq, we continue to support the government's initiatives to strengthen fiscal management and improve service delivery. Progress in these areas will strengthen Iraqi sovereignty and provide an effective counter to Iranian influences within the society. Another key area of focus is our support for religious and ethnic minorities in northern Iraq. Building on the $400 million investment we have made thus far to help communities recover from the atrocities of ISIS, the administration is requesting $150 million to support vulnerable religious and ethnic minority groups globally. This investment will help ensure these communities are able to remain in their historical homelands and to thrive as crucial components of their larger societies. I want to note that as part of our effort to expand USAID's partner base as a global initiative, earlier this month, Administrator Green announced 6 direct awards to local Iraqi organizations who are working to implement our programming with ethnic and religious communities who have been targeted for genocide. We point with pride to our pilot early grade reading and high school programs targeting science, technology, engineering, and math programs in Egypt. The government of Egypt has now expanded these programs across the country, demonstrating the capacity to take on these successes and address and forward the country's development effort. But let's be clear, job creation across the region is a key concern. Our work with the private sector is yielding results. We recently handed diplomas and employment contracts to the first group of logistics students who graduated in the Suez Corridor logistics training program. And we're doing similar job matching projects across the region, helping both the firms and the young people they will employ. In Tunisia, with the support of Congress, and in particular this subcommittee, the United States has played an important role since 2011 in solidifying the country's democratic transition. During my recent visit there, I was very honored to officially reopen the USAID Tunisia office as a full mission, and on that same trip to sign our first 5-year bilateral agreement with Tunisia. While there, I traveled to Kairouan in Tunisia's interior, where I had the pleasure of visiting USAID businesses that are now growing, and with young people who are actively participating with their local governments in setting the path forward for their communities. And before I close, a word on burden sharing, just to echo the Assistant Secretary's remarks. The administration's foreign assistance request prioritizes investments matched by host government commitments and encourages international donors to share the burden of development. Our work in Syria is an example. USAID programs have restored water and electricity to hundreds of thousands of Syrians in areas liberated from ISIS. We help revitalize agriculture, rehabilitate canals, and all these activities were funded by our coalition partners. We will continue to put U.S. interests first and to be full partners in advancing U.S. national interests in this region. With the support of Congress and through the strategic, efficient use of resources, we will continue to present the best of the American people to the people of the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you, sir, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you again for being here, and sincere thanks for your work in service to the country, advancing American interests and admirably representing American values throughout the region. We'll now begin 5-minute questioning. I'll begin, followed by the ranking member, and then we'll alternate between the parties. Assistant Secretary Schenker, last week, the Iranian Foreign Ministry reportedly sent to the United States a list of people it's demanding in a proposed prisoner swap. The regime also made another proposal for a prisoner exchange back in April. Could you speak to the administration's view of Iran's recent proposal and tell us whether the administration would engage in a prisoner exchange with Iran, or does it reject the idea on principle?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The United States and the administration, the priority is to get back our Americans held unjustly in Iran, basically hostages over there. This is not a prisoner exchange. We're talking about exchanging people who have been kidnapped, Americans who are in Iran versus Iranian prisoners, people who have done illegal things here like try and, for example, kill the Saudi ambassador in Georgetown through an Iranian plot. That said, it is a priority to get our people back, and we are looking into all sorts of opportunities if they should present themselves, but I can't get into details.
No. Can you comment on these reports of this proposal?
I cannot.
Can you tell us whether there are any talks underway with Iran to secure the release of Americans and U.S. legal permanent residents held hostage?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into those details here. What I would say is that it's a priority for us to get our people back, but there has been a history, actually, of these type of offers, and Iran generally leverages them. And when you pay for this type of behavior, when you pay for kidnapping, you generally get more.
To both of you, let me ask about the administration's freezing of assistance to West Bank Gaza in August of 2018. If Congress acts to remove the constraints imposed by the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, should the United States consider resuming certain types of aid to Palestinians, and if so, which types and under which conditions?
Well, let me start by saying that the administration supports the victims of terrorism. This is an important piece of legislation.
Assistant Secretary, does the administration support the so-called ACA fix?
We are willing to engage with Congress on every level to fix that.
Assistant Administrator Harvey, can you answer the question about whether aid should, and if so, which type of aid should flow again, assuming the ACA fix addresses that issue?
Well, I will let the Assistant Secretary address the issue of whether there should be an ACA fix. That's a broader conversation. If assistance were to resume, if the political decision were made that the circumstances would justify that, we would take a look very closely with our Palestinian partners to determine where to start. I wouldn't want to prejudge it now, but historically, water and wastewater have been very high priorities for both the Israeli government neighbors and the Palestinians themselves, and I'm sure that would be at least one place where we would start.
Okay, so Assistant Secretary Schenker, let me get back to you. So assuming that, thank you for your offer to work with us, assuming that an ACA fix is achieved, should aid start to flow? Would the administration recognize the benefits of any type of aid flowing to West Bank and Gaza?
I think that would be something that would have to come after the rollout of the peace plan. But I can't really comment on whether.
Why is that?
Well, I think that there is this enormous aid package that awaits the Palestinians that underpins this the peace proposal.
So let's talk about that. Do you have what? Can you tell us what role your desk has played, or you personally have played, in helping to draft this peace process?
None.
But you're aware of what's in it?
No. I've seen public statements from Social Advisor Kushner about this that talk about raising money to underwrite.
Okay, then let me just focus on the one issue of U.S. security assistance. Help me understand why we should wait for a peace proposal that may come soon or may never come at all to resume the funding of the security coordinator that helps to protect Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We would love to spend that right now. We have allocated $35 million. We have the security coordinator out there. We have it fully staffed. We are underwriting that. We would like to spend this $35 million to do the train and equip. We're just being held back by the ACTA.
And finally,
that's good to go. That $35 million.
And any other projects? Are there any other projects, since my understanding, Assistant Administrator Harvey, is operations have essentially wound down in West Bank and Gaza as a result of both the combination of ATCA and the administration's decision to withhold all funds. So can you prioritize where funds would be spent?
I don't have a list right now, but I can get back to you on that.
I would
think, by the way, I would think that wastewater management would be, as Mike Harvey said, would be a leading factor, public health.
I appreciate that, Mr. Wilson. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank both of you for being here. Thank you for your service. And both of you, I know, make a difference on behalf of freedom and democracy in the world. Assistant Secretary Schenker, what is the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau of the State Department doing to counter Iranian influence in the region?
Well, first of all, we're implementing crushing sanctions on the Iranians. This has resulted in denied some $50 billion in oil revenue, and is likely going to result in a constriction of their economy by double digits by the end of 2019. This economic pressure provides them with less money with which to fund their regional proxies, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, which are facing increased pressure because of the lack of funds available to them. That's on one side. We are working with our partners to multilaterally constrain Iran's malign behavior. This is building coalitions in the region, whether through the International Maritime Security Construct, also known as Operation Sentinel, and also calling out Iran by name, something the E3 did to hold Iran responsible for what it did in Aramco a few weeks back. That's sort of unprecedented. Likewise, we are exposing the Iranian regime's brutality and governance problems. We are working through local partners. We are strengthening and financially backing the Lebanese armed forces, which someday could serve as a counterbalance to some of Iran's pernicious activities in Lebanon. We are pressing our Saudi allies, and actually with some prospect of success, to get a peace agreement in Yemen, which would roll back the pernicious Houthi influence.
Well, we appreciate each of your initiatives. And can either of you here today guarantee to the subcommittee that no U.S. taxpayers' funds are sent to the Iraqi government, which, including the Iraqi Federal Police, which could be dispersed to the Iranian-backed militias operating in the country?
I believe that's the case. We're not providing any FMF to Iraq this year, but I'll have to check on the other funds. I believe that they're not funding the Hashtag directly.
Thank you. And then, Assistant Secretary, what is your assessment of the relationship between the UN operations within Syria and the Assad regime in Damascus? Would you say the Assad regime benefits from U.S. programming in Syria?
Well, if I can punt to Mike Harvey on that, my understanding is no, that it does not benefit the Assad regime.
Congressman, you're raising a very, very serious issue that concerns us greatly. As you know, the one activity that we do have in Assad-controlled areas is our humanitarian assistance program that is implemented almost exclusively through UN agencies, with a few exceptions. And the issue of keeping control over resources and ensuring the integrity of that program is a constant challenge. But it's something we work very closely with our UN partners on. We watch very closely, and please do keep the attention on it, as we will as well.
And I'm grateful that we have bipartisan legislation on this point. And I know it's not covered very often, but actually people of both parties can work together substantially, particularly in the Middle East. And then, Secretary Schenker, are there any U.S. citizens currently held or detained by the Saudi government, and what efforts is the administration making for their release?
Thank you. This is an issue of concern. There is Walid Fatahi, who is a dual national, who's being held by the Saudis. We have been engaging with the Saudi government continuously about the case of Mr. Fatahi. He had been held for some 2 years without charge, and recently he was charged and released, and they are going through a trial. We view that as a positive development, and hopefully that trial will be over soon, and Mr. Fatahi will be exonerated and be able to come home.
And thank you for following through on that, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Allred, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your service to our country. I am trying, though, to discern this administration's policy in the Middle East. On this subcommittee, we have heard testimony that has been widely ranging and I think been conflicting as well. The president says he wants to support Israel, but I think he has taken many steps that have empowered Iran. The president said that he wants to destroy ISIS, but we have handed them a lifeline in Syria with our actions. And Mr. Schenker, you've talked about how this budget is intended to stabilize the region while you're also calling for large cuts to that budget. And so I'm trying to understand what our policy is in the Middle East. And I want to begin with these cuts to foreign aid and to the priorities that you have laid out, that many of them I agree with, and the justification has been to increase, quote, burden sharing across international partners. Do you believe that this is actually going to lead to our allies contributing more, or are we just giving Russia, Iran, and China a bigger opening to increase their influence in the region?
Thank you, Congressman. No, I believe that actually our partners have stepped up. I think the best example of that would be Syria, where the president, the administration zeroed out the budget last year of $300 million for humanitarian assistance. And we raised among our partners $325 million, including $180 million from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They stepped up, and they have stepped up again and made similar commitments for this year. I think across the board we find our allies.
And you find these commitments to be sustainable? I'm wondering because we have a national security interest in this region. We don't use foreign aid out of the goodness of our hearts in all cases. We use it because it stabilizes countries. It allows us not to have to commit our brave men and women to conflicts abroad. We have a national security interest in it. If we are shaking down our allies and getting them to step in while we're not going to pay, then maybe in the short term that's something that we can do. But I don't see that as a sustainable Middle East policy for the United States.
Sir, I understand your concern. So far, we have been successful in raising funds from our allies. I think that we have to go every day and make the case to them about why it's not only in our interest, but it's in their interest. Certainly, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have stepped up on Syria. But across the board, if they see things and share in many ways the same threat perception in the region, and are willing to back our efforts.
Yeah. Let's talk about Syria, and let's talk about how this Turkish incursion impacts this budget request. Is this budget request reflective of these current events, or is this something that was formulated before these events?
The budget was formulated before the Turkish invasion.
And so how is this invasion going to impact this request and your plans in the region?
Yes, well, that's a good question. Well, we have in the budget quite a bit of flexibility. Not only the president had said immediately after the invasion that we would provide $50 million plus another $4.5 million to support the white helmets and $50 million for humanitarian assistance. We have also obligated funds, if necessary, if there's a mass refugee flow of Syrian Kurds or Syrians into Iraqi Kurdish area. And we have flexibility through the Relief and Recovery Fund, which has $145 million in it, and through the Diplomatic Progress Fund.
Okay. So I understand. We want to be, if we're going to appropriate, we need to be part of the discussion about how this is going forward. That's what I'm trying to get to. So I see you have some plans. So Assistant Administrator Harvey, if you could talk about what USAID's role will be in this potential refugee crisis that we're seeing unfolding in northern Syria.
When we are dealing with the issue of refugees, we will be working very closely with our State Department colleagues in the Refugee Bureau. We have been supporting the humanitarian assistance programming within Syria, which includes both people who are in their homes, but also people who have been displaced by the conflict. We've got about 90,000 people displaced from the recent Turkish actions, whom we will be supporting through the ongoing existing humanitarian assistance program. For the most part, we have access to them, and our partners are implementing programs remarkably. We have about 12,000 refugees who have crossed into Iraq. The systems are in place and the resources are in place to deal with that population. We actually are using a planning figure of about 50,000. If we're lucky, we won't get anywhere near that if the ceasefire holds and Turkish operations stay where they are. My worry is less of dealing with the immediate humanitarian situation as it is sort of reestablishing political stability in that area, and that's going to be a serious challenge for all of us.
I agree, and that's why I disagree with the budget request. We will formulate what we think is necessary, as we did in fiscal year 19, and thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Albright. Mr. Kinzinger, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Specifically on USAID, I want to say you guys, I don't think you guys get enough credit, and just generally with State Department, you guys don't get enough credit, because when you alleviate a conflict, obviously you don't know that it's been alleviated until when it's unsuccessful. So I want to thank you and your folks for all the good work, and you know, specifically, I think it's important to try to make sure we're spending taxpayer resources effectively and efficiently in a targeted way. I think we shouldn't cut those resources simply to cut them. We should make sure they're efficient. But I also, you know, it's important to make sure when we do that, we are following the president's priorities, even if we disagree. And that's, you know, where we come into play, especially in an area like this. But I especially want to commend, obviously, the people who took out al-Baghdadi this weekend. It was a great thing. It's not the end of the war on ISIS. This is a generational fight. This is going to go on for a long time, and I think we have to accept and understand that. That's where you guys come in extremely importantly as well, making sure that that next generation is not radicalized, and that not only are they not radicalized, that they actually push back against radicalization. But, you know, the more leaders we kill, the dumber they get. It's like in Iraq when we did that during the surge. You take them out and you accelerate the number you're taking out, and pretty soon they run out of people to lead, and it capitulates. So I wanted, obviously I've expressed a lot of concerns generally with Syria's policy, but I'll leave those for now. But I do want to turn to the regime, who I think the corruption was key to Baghdadi's caliphate, and there's a whole lot on the inception of ISIS and what Bashar al-Assad did. But I think now it seems all but certain that Assad will consolidate much control over the country. Mr. Harvey, you mentioned about, you know, rebuilding and USAID projects within Assad-controlled territory. I want to echo what my colleague, Mr. Wilson, said. We do not want taxpayer dollars going to prop up Assad, and so you can add me to that list, and I know you guys are with me on that too. So, but as the founder of the Syria caucus, I'm going to continue to urge my colleagues to hold those responsible for war crimes in Syria accountable. So, Mr. Schenker, if President Trump were to sign, I think he's said he's willing to do it. We have one Senate holdout. But if he signs into law the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019, what kind of an impact would that have on the Assad regime and their supporters?
Thank you, and I share with you the pleasure at the killing of Baghdadi. This was
It's worth celebrating for sure.
yeah, no, it's a great thing, but there is no knockout blow. Listen, I think that it's important that we recognize what Assad has done. We are spending money and funding projects to document the mass atrocities. We are working on record keeping and underwriting some of that. This is a regime that is beyond the pale, and we are focused narrowly on three things in Syria: preventing the resurgence of ISIS. We are working on preventing Iranian influence in the country and rolling that back, and also a political future through the implementation of 2254. And this is the issue about Caesar. This is a regime that cannot be allowed to persist as is. The people have to have a say in the direction of their country. Refugees were not ancillary to this conflict. Assad ethnically cleansed his country of Sunni Muslims. He wanted to get rid of them. So the Caesar Act, I think, is very important in that regard and holding to account.
And I think another point on that is, look, it's going to be out of those refugee camps that Assad created. Where do you get radicalization? Because people are hopeless, uneducated in many cases, and it's easy to blame whoever. And that's where you find radicalization. So countering that's going to be important. And can you also address, with Putin obviously standing up the Assad regime, how are you guys working to counter their malign influence in the region?
The Iranians are playing, I'm sorry, the Syrians are, the Russians are playing a pernicious role across the region. It's not just in Syria, it's in Libya and elsewhere. We're working on a number of strategies. We're trying to contain them by working with our allies. We're certainly hammering our allies with warnings about CAATSA sanctions and others, but also letting them know, I think having a frank dialogue about what Russia does when they're on the ground.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm out of time, and I appreciate your service, but I think it's important to, it's a lesson when they, basically showed up in Syria in 2012 or 2013. It's a lesson because we see them in Venezuela and we'll see them elsewhere. Stop them early, prevent them from coming in. Thank you both for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Schenker, I'm gonna start off by just reading the lead of a story in the Wall Street Journal from yesterday about Egypt and about one young woman in particular, Esra Abdel Fattah, who's a political activist in that country. The lead of the story is Egyptian security officers grabbed her from her car in the country's capital on October 12th and blindfolded her, took her to a secure facility. Two lawyers who visited her in prison says she was slapped, beaten on her arms and back, threatened with electrocution as officers demanded the password to her mobile phone. When she refused, the officers bound her hands and legs, choked her with her own jacket, forcibly used her fingers to unlock the phone. And you know as well as I do, I know your experience and you know mine, that this is a routine story in Egypt. And things have gotten worse in the last month. More than 4,000 people detained since protests seeking the removal of President Sisi started up, the largest, I think, wave of arrests that the country has seen since he came to power. And I don't think I need to ask you if this is wrong, because I'm sure you agree that it is. But I will ask this, since our policy towards Egypt is based, or allegedly based, on advancing our security interests, does this kind of repression, which is escalating now, help or hurt legitimate efforts to fight extremism and terrorism in the country?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm familiar with that story. I know Esra. I've met her several times. I think it's outrageous. You should know that I had the Egyptian ambassador in my office last week to talk about Esra. This matters greatly to the administration. Egypt has a long way to go on human rights. You heard the administration made a statement in September talking about the rights of Egyptians to demonstrate peacefully and the obligation of the Egyptian authorities to protect demonstrators. This is something that is very important to the administration. We talk about it.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad that you did that. But I guess I'm asking a more fundamental question, because I remember sitting in your chair a few years ago saying something along the lines of Egypt has a long way to go, and it seems to have an even longer way to go today. And yet here we have the same security relationship that we used to have. Any progress in Sinai over the last several years? And once again, the question I would ask you, do their tactics help or hurt in the fight against what we say is our shared enemy?
Actually, on Sinai, they have made some progress. I think it's incremental. They have received training that is more narrowly tailored to that type of counterterrorism mission. But more importantly, they have recognized, and I think through our council, that counterterrorism requires more than just a military component. And I'll actually let my colleague, Mike Harvey, talk about what we're doing and what the Egyptians are doing in this Sinai in that regard.
Well, actually, hold on. I don't have that much time, so because I have a different question I wanted to ask Mr. Harvey. But look, I would just say the fundamental problem here is that, even as the president pulls back from Syria, claims that it's just a bunch of sand and we need to get out of the Middle East and we can't do these things forever, when the people we were helping, both Kurdish and Arab, are actually fighting and dying with us to fight terrorism, many of whom absolutely share our values, incredibly brave civil society activists who we are no longer supporting because we have pulled back so much of our programming there, and yet we continue to spend $1.3 billion of the taxpayers' money helping the Egyptian military put on military parades with their tanks. And that doesn't sit well with me. I have a very quick question with very little time left for you, Mr. Harvey, and it's about Yemen. When was the last time we, USAID or through the UN, provided a no-strike list to the Saudi military in terms of humanitarian locations, targets that we asked them not to hit in Yemen?
Congressman, I actually can't answer that question. I don't know, but I do know that it's a constant point of discussion between our two governments.
Okay. So, but we have provided them with no strike lists.
We certainly have,
Okay.
both through AID and through our DoD colleagues.
Okay. I think that's a very important thing to confirm on the record because we have, not just broad concerns about human rights and targeting that we've shared with the Saudis that they haven't always listened to, but specific locations and coordinates that they have hit that we have specifically given them as locations not to hit. I think that elevates this to the highest possible level of concern. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to apologize for not being here to hear the testimony. I had an honor flight down the World War II Memorial, and that's obviously a priority. And we see those great American heroes. It used to be mostly World War II veterans like my father, who would be 100 if he were still alive next month. But now it's Korean War veterans and Vietnam War veterans and on and on. But it's one of those things, so I apologize for not being here a little earlier. And if I repeat some of the questions that perhaps were already answered, I apologize for that too. But I certainly appreciate the tougher line that this administration has taken against Iran for the most part, which under the free hand given by the JCPOA greatly expanded its influence in the region. I'd like to focus on Iran's so-called land bridge to the Mediterranean. A critical goal of this quarter is for Iran to be able to threaten and potentially ultimately attack one of our most significant allies in the world, and that's Israel. Could either one of the gentlemen here discuss the administration's plans to curtail Iran's ability to move equipment or supplies or fighters into and through Syria and onto the Israeli border?
Thank you, Congressman. The land bridge is an issue of enormous concern to the administration. Before the Turkish incursion into northern Syria, the positioning of our troops there as an ancillary benefit to being present and fighting ISIS there had limited Iran's ability in some way to do everything it wanted. We still have residual presence there that as long as we're able to provide security and stability and work with our SDF partners in these areas, which we continue to do, that may limit Iran's ability somewhat. But this is a priority, and if we curtail our presence, then it would become more difficult to do so. As you know, the Israelis appear to be they have hit Iranian targets in Syria for some time. Attempted weapons transfers to Lebanon. This is something that's not a secret. So that in some ways is also curtailing the efforts to establish this land bridge full time.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything?
Not specifically, Congressman, because we're a few steps to the side of that broader debate, but much of what USAID sort of premises its development activities in this region on is that enabling these countries to stand on their own as fully sovereign countries that control their destiny, it better enables them to push back from the nefarious intent of both Iran, Russia, and others.
Yeah, if I might add, I mean, in some ways, the weak link there has been Iraq, right, more than Syria. As you know, Iran is storing ballistic missiles in Iraq. Iraq is not able to exert its sovereignty and push back. This is a real problem and will remain a problem for some time until Iraq can exert sovereignty.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure that my next question has probably been mentioned and discussed prior to my being here. Obviously, the taking out al-Baghdadi was a huge victory. Just a horrific, horrible individual, the head of probably the most despicable organization that we've seen in a long time. So I want to commend the President and all those that worked with him in accomplishing this, and obviously principally our men and women in uniform who, took the action to end this horrible person's time on this earth. Could you discuss the administration's plans moving forward to ensure that ISIS does not reestablish itself under, a new caliphate under, especially in Syria, under a new leader? What are the administration's plans at this point in ensuring that that doesn't happen?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a top priority for the administration, the fight against ISIS, the prevention of the resurgence of ISIS 2.0. Contrary to what many people say, the administration continues to work with our SDF partners on the ground in Syria. We have troops embedded with units, and we continue to fight ISIS there. And that will be a key point of our presence going forward, whether in Atanf or outside that area. So I would anticipate counterterrorism mission will remain a very high priority for the indefinite future. This is, I think, as Congressman Kinzinger said, it's a generational mission.
Very good. Thank you very much. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Keating, you're recognized.
Well, thank you. Question, just following up, on Iraq. It's a great concern. We've seen the demonstrations. We know the situation there in detail. We know that there was an order for non-emergency personnel in May to leave. That's going to run out next month. It seems from the budget there's been a cut in security funds. Does that represent what the future is there? It's such a critical area, along with so many other areas. But without a presence there, it's going to be that much more difficult from the state side. Could you comment on what the prospects look like in this critical area right now that often gets overlooked?
Thank you. I share your concern. The safety and well-being of the diplomats in NEA is a top priority for me. It's my responsibility in many ways. So we are on order departure. We have been, and in 8 days or 7 days, it will be 6 months. The security situation is such that this is what I believe is the new normal. That said, while we have not the height of the numbers that we had before, we have sufficient numbers on the ground to do our mission. And in fact, even under ordered departure, this year, even so far, we have done more visits with Iraqi, more engagements with Iraqi parliamentarians outside of the embassy compound than we did when we had our full complement the year before we went on ordered departure. So we are engaged diplomatically in a way that, that as we were before, even more so. Our military presence there, while the FMF has been zeroed out, part of this is burden sharing, but part of it also is that the military has CTAF funding, where it can do train and equip and fund and work with the Iraqi military, notwithstanding the absence of FMF. So we remain engaged. We have numbers of troops there. We have a full diplomatic corps. I have been in Iraq maybe 4 times in the past 4 months. So this is a priority for us. If you want to roll back Iran in the region, this is the beachhead. And we are there, and we are not leaving.
Yeah, well, thank you for your engagement in that. Just briefly, there's been 14 million Yemenis on the verge of starvation. 85,000 have died of famine. Are we engaging with multilaterals? What are we doing there to try and help one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world? Yemen. Sorry. Oh, your microphone is on. Yeah. Your mic is. Thank you.
Yemen is a remarkable challenge for all of us. It is one of the largest humanitarian assistance programs anywhere. It is an extremely difficult place to do work. The de facto authorities in the north, the Houthis, make it very difficult. And yet, despite that, we are extremely proud of the performance of our WFP colleagues in particular, but also UNICEF, WHO, and the panoply of American and international NGOs who've been working in Yemen.
Good. Thank you for your work. I just wanted to touch one other topic, too. It's hard in 5 minutes. But I've long felt that we could have a greater significance if we could better work with our EU allies on their development programs and sort of coordinate better what they're doing and what we're doing in critical areas of the world. Is there an opportunity to even have a multiplier effect beyond what we're doing now? Because I think there's an enormous opportunity that way.
Congressman, I couldn't agree with you more. The EU is an interesting institution. I'll leave it at that. What's in countries like Yemen, where we are almost entirely dependent upon the UN, it's easier because that mechanism sort of forces joint pooled funding of activities. In countries where we have more bilateral programming, there is more coordination than you might see. But they are, to be perfectly honest, challenging partners because of their bureaucracy is even slower than ours. And whenever I'm feeling frustrated about AID's bureaucracy, I just look at the others and I feel a little better. But it is something that we're committed to. We have folks assigned in Brussels where we meet with our Brussels counterparts. But let's not forget that the German, the French, the British bilateral assistance programs, especially the British and the Germans, are huge around the world. And those bilateral partnerships are extremely close. I mean, having spent 4 years dealing with Boko Haram in Nigeria, not successfully, but that's another conversation, the partnership we had with the Brits and the Germans was as good as it could get.
Good. I hope it's something our committee and the subcommittee I chair can continue to work on. Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Schenker, accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is vital to the broader U.S. interest in supporting the rights and freedoms of individuals, in particular freedom of the press. Does not failing to provide consequences for the Khashoggi assassination embolden the perpetrators, and what's the administration doing to prevent this possibility?
Thank you, Congressman. Accountability, the Secretary has said, is critical in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, getting to the bottom of it. I knew Khashoggi. It's something that matters to me personally as well. In 2018, the administration sanctioned some 17 Saudis involved in the murder of Khashoggi with the global Magnitsky sanctions. Right now, there's some 11 defendants in Saudi Arabia in the middle of a trial. I think both the defense and the prosecution have finished their cases, and we're waiting on verdicts. I think the judicial process, as we see it, falls short of full accountability, and we've indicated that to the Saudis. We're encouraging, nonetheless, a fair and transparent judicial process.
It certainly seems like we're not getting that at the end of the day. But under Crown Prince, again, the Saudi government's intensified its crackdown on dissidents, human rights activists. In 2018, the repression was directed against the leading women's rights advocates. who are seeking to end the male guardianship system that enables systematic abuse and repression. In May of 2018, authorities arrested a dozen prominent women rights activists and accused several others of grave crimes, including treason, directly related to their activism. There's also reports that women were subjected to sexual harassment and torture. What's the State Department's view on Saudi Arabia's crackdown against these activists and dissidents?
Thank you. It's a concern of the administration and the State Department, some of these human rights allegations of abuse. But I like to say that it's a bit of a mixed bag here. For example, the Saudi government in the last 4 months ended the guardianship law. So now women can travel abroad without the permission of their children, for example, or a male guardian. Several of the women drivers have been released from jail. Waleed Fatahi, who I talked about before, a dual national U.S. citizen, is now been charged and is on trial, but has been released from jail. You know, on other issues, they've been actually very positive as well. The Saudi government is working to put the Yemeni government back together by fostering negotiations between the Southern Transitional Council and the Hadi government. They're about to get an agreement on that. They have a de-escalation with the Houthis that actually appears to be taking hold. At our encouragement, they gave last month $500 million to humanitarian assistance in Yemen. So let's say that Saudi, too, has some way to come or some room for improvement in terms of human rights, but they are working on it. They are putting together a committee on trafficking in human persons to look into this more closely, so they don't have some sort of bad rating next year from the assessment from the U.S. government next year. I actually think they are making an effort, and in some places succeeding.
So it's an effort, but it looks like there's lots of room to go. We still have dissidents in jail. We still have lots of conversation about torture and abuse that they're suffering. We still have a crown prince that has not been held accountable. So yeah, progress, great, but we're not where we need to be, and I think we need to continue to pressure and push for where we should be. We all know morally where we should be.
Well, thank you. This is a topic of ongoing discussion between us and the Saudis, but I think that while we should continue pushing where credit is due, I think we should give them credit.
Now, quickly to Tunisia. The elections just happened in Tunisia. We like to see a move in a good direction, but we've cut foreign aid from 86 million roughly in half. Do you have concerns about the message that sends?
Thank you. We think that the number is right on Tunisia in two parts. By the way, we too think that the elections were a dramatic success and see this as really a positive development. I was just in Tunisia last month, right before the elections. I met with the Independent Electoral Commission. It's something that is a source of, I think, should be a source of pride for them and certainly for the region. It's unusual. We think the number is the right figure. We are the FMF, the INCOL, the money that we provide for the security forces is the same, basically, but some of the ESF has decreased. And if we need to, we can make that up with MEPI. They also get a great deal of money from Europeans, once again, burden sharing. And all this money, there's an issue of absorptive capacity. So we think we're at the right amount.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. I just had a couple of follow-ups, and then Mr. Wilson, if he has any. Assistant Secretary Schenker, you said Iraq is a beachhead. I think you were referring to Iraq as beachhead in confronting Iranian aggression. Is that right? November is the 6-month statutory deadline for extending the order of departures, and you've got to decide the future of U.S. government presence in Iraq. Are there plans to strengthen the security of the U.S. Embassy in Iraq to enable the return of U.S. personnel, or tell me where that stands?
Yeah, this has been something I spent a great deal of time on, actually. You know, safety and security of diplomatic personnel. and Iraq in particular. I don't want to get into the details of how we came to discussions. We think the security at the embassy is adequate, actually better than adequate.
Sufficient for the return of personnel. To enable U.S. personnel and the resumption of the vital work.
To accomplish the mission.
Yeah.
And we've got a number of diplomats that we think is appropriate. And I can brief you about this in another setting.
Okay.
But yeah,
Great.
we are committed to the mission.
I would like to do that if we can arrange that. And then finally, also on the topic of Iran, this time in Syria, I think if I understood you, you said if we curtail our presence, it would be more difficult to prevent effectively the land bridge that was asked about earlier. Did I understand you correctly? And when you say if we curtail our presence the way we're doing, if we curtail our presence beyond what we're doing, what were you referring to?
Referring to basically beyond what we're doing. But as Ambassador Jeffrey said during, I believe during his testimony to you, our presence is a stabilizing force, and to the degree that we are present, it sets better conditions for the right things to happen in Syria.
So I'll ask, so are you confident that the current strategy effectively prevents Iran from establishing that land bridge that this committee in particular has worried so much about?
I think it complicates Iranian efforts to do so.
Does the administration assess U.S. efforts to prevent the spread of Iranian influence in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon as successful?
So I think it's a work in progress. In Iraq right now, a lot of the intracommunal violence that you're seeing is based on, our belief is, Iranian overreach because Iran is so enmeshed in the society. Many Shiite there, like everywhere throughout the region, are Shiite nationalists and are pushing back on this.
And so let me just wrap up again on this issue of the land bridge. So how many troops are in Tanif?
Not at liberty to say.
But the withdrawal of troops from northern Syria, the withdrawal of troops, I just want to make sure I understand.
There's still a residual U.S. presence that goes beyond a ton of.
And you're confident that whatever that number is, that residual presence is sufficient to prevent Iran from establishing the land bridge from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus over to Beirut?
I think it plays a positive role on that front.
Well, I'm sure some is better than none. I'm just asking whether it's a sufficient number to prevent Iran from establishing that.
I really can't comment.
Okay. I appreciate anything further, Mr. Wilson. Great. Well, thanks. I thank the witnesses and all of the members for being here today. Thanks for your testimony, Assistant Secretary Schenker and Assistant Administrator Harvey. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask our witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. I would ask my colleagues to submit those questions for the hearing record within 5 business days. And with that, and without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.